Okay, this lesson for the Cornell Project class is a response to my thousands of replies, inquiries, questions. Some were just people emoting, which is okay. I find it charming. I mean, I'm from the real world, so I often find myself amused at just how people perceive some religious person, a preacher or a pastor, for example, and they just launch out at you. And I thought, well, in the real world, before I was so known, they wouldn't have approached me at all. So I did know, however, and did learn, however, that in organizational behavior, we had people who a culture would form. And for example, we, like managers who were there for years, let's say, would start developing an attitude of, well, I worked here 15 years before I was promoted. And some person would come in off the street, quote a new guy, and in just a few weeks he's promoted and doing well. And their attitude became, if I had to work that long to get to where I'm at, you should have to do the same. And it was quite remarkable to me because I noticed that some people might have 30 years experience, but really they only have 6 months experience and work 29 and a half years just repeating that first 6 months of how to get by. Well, it also, on the other hand, there were people in organizations who had been perceived that they had been manipulated or played by the man, and they would lead initiatives in their company to maybe unionize or they would file grievances. So what was striking is you would come into an organization, let's say, and it's been there for decades, and it would have all this nomenclature and mixture in the culture of people who've been hurt, burned. There's a book out titled Hurt People, Hurt People. Well, we all know that. Well, played people play people. For example, they've, let's say, suffered loss of opportunities, advantages. Let's say you were out there and you, as one preacher was telling me, in his case, he said he was once taught. He was taught something he called old earth. So rather than evaluate, define, document, disclose fallible elements, which would require evaluation, compare it to the scriptures, he just, let's say, he just moved over, switched sides to young earth, meaning I'll burn the bridges with these who told me this, and I'll go out and I'll start young earth. But what he might not notice, because the blind spot is because of emotion and a lack of evaluation. For if you just compare this to this, but not this to the Bible and not this to the Bible, so he begins to play the people and decry the people who played him. If you switch, as people have, I have really been fascinated as a social scientist with the novel trend and very amplified emphasis on young earth, anti-gap, anti-old, even watching people throw others under the bus, trying to somehow uh, imply, if not outright accuse, uh, pastors, professors, authors, believers, Christians, church members in the Lord's churches, even of being advocates of evolution if they picked this, which couldn't be any further from the truth. But you'd say, well, why would they do that? Well, they they saw themselves somewhat left behind as the trend moved. So they began to promote theirs, you see, and they're they're playing the people to go away from that. Well, there's just one problem. If you actually studied the Bible, you'd have seen the ratio. You'd have noticed the time interval. You'd have noticed the chiasmus inversion. But you say, well, what do you mean you'd notice that? Well, as those who are trained to take our tools at the seminary we have a panoply of tools, which means there's really nothing we can't investigate. There's not a topic we can't evaluate. We're trained to take a holistic approach, zoom out, take a full scope view from the view of a systemic approach from our systematic theology teacher, a categorical approach, use the Bible words, the hermeneutics professor, the holistic approach, our language professor, look at the etymology, go to lexicons, use lexicography, and then, of course, observe carefully the inflectional morphemes, kind of, action, and the emphasis. So when you do that, you really won't find yourself being played by young earthers coming back this way. Because what do you say to your pastor who was once played in his mind by young earthers, and now he's adamant as he was once about young earth, he's now adamant about old earth? Well, that's what happens. So if hurt people, and they do, and as a person who's quite trained in social science, you'll notice this is, which is quite intriguing, because that's why I really am impressed with the term Baptist. They're neither Catholic nor Protestant, nor Judaic, nor Islamic, nor occultic, nor New Age, nor denominational one, denominational two. They're not even non-denominational. They're pre-denominational. So I was fascinated with these people, especially when I noticed their relationship to Einstein and his ability to come here to this country to escape persecution, their relationship with the founding scientists, political scientists who founded our nation, such as Thomas Jefferson, who referenced them, their relationship to the Trail of Tears as they incited and brought focus, sympathy, much needed sympathy, and pricked the conscience of a nation. They were instrumental in the disestablishment of religion in the United States, which again just fascinated me. And then like John Leland was instrumental in what we call bills of rights, especially the right to peaceably assemble. But to notice that those people were out, they'd come out from that. So how do you notice that? I mean, if we're using data, I mean, why do people not see one day to 1,000 years? Well, like a lot of honest theologians will tell you, and people who, let's say you pursue design curriculum and you want to understand in research. Let's say you engage in research in any field and you notice blind spots in pre-understanding. So number two, for example, if you've been played, or as one preacher I know, he published and was an advocate. I mean, he published pre-tribism. And then he went on and he personally identified himself as pre-tribber. He was donning this as the core position to the point where when you heard him speak, it was presented as infallible. He then donned the identity as now he's a pre-tribber, which, again, as a social scientist, I'm fascinated by it. Except I admire Baptists too much to be distracted by this, but I do study this, because when I see, for example, a Baptist fall into this type of things, you ask yourself, well, why did you bother to not be Protestant nor Catholic? Why did you bother not to be Judaic, Islamic, occultic, New Age, or any of the denominationals or non-denominational? Why did you abandon your faith that was here pre-denominational, pre-Catholic, pre-Protestant, pre-whatever? Wasn't pre-Judaic, but persecuted by Judaizers. So I was really struck because, but now you can see why someone would not want to hear. So as someone told me recently, it came to my attention, someone was saying that someone's now switched and he's teaching post-trib, and now he's publishing that. He's now identifying himself, so he's ID'd as a post-tribber. So he's been played, now he's going to play us again. So he's playing us, recruiting us, come to my pre-tribism, or this one was played to say, come to my old earth, and no, come over here, I want to play people to come to my young earth, and completely ignore young is chronological, old is geological, the ratio, 1 day to 1,000 years, 1,000 years to a day, and all that's all worked out. We can notice it just using the scriptures. We don't have to dig in the ground or look up in the sky. But so now he's ID'd as a post-tribber. And you say, well, why would he do that? Well, you remember somebody played him by priming him and making him suppose, or him being willing. I shouldn't say make him. I would say they catalyzed him. And so he bought into pre-trib, and now he's swung over here. Well, he never evaluated. Let's just say that. One thing these people who've been played will do, rather than played preachers evaluate text, it's played preachers play people. I mean, we're going to be on the right side of this time. We're going to, when the trends come and every trend of doctrine blows our way, we want to be on the right bandwagon, even though those who pastor the Lord's churches know that bandwagon's just on the broad way to destruction. So you really could have evaluated and noticed there's tribulation. Could have noticed there's the tribulation, the great one. There we go. Could have noticed that this is where hell on earth, the second half, this is where there's very peaceful, if you know anything about it, because there's supposed to be a covenant breaks here and problems really start here. So really it speaks of the scope and the scale, just like we know the Great Commission in scope and scale, all the nations until the end of the age. The limited commission was temporal and only to the nation of Israel. So you'll notice the word after the tribulation that Jesus said it's in association with. So somewhere in all this, we know in Revelation 3:10, everyone knows that. If you're a member of one of the Lord's churches, 3:10, we're promised to be kept out from the great trial that will come upon the earth. Revelation 7:14, we come out from. So when this escalates and it becomes a full maximum scale, Jesus and his holy angels return, and then we're relocated immediately. The dead in Christ are raised first. We which are alive and remaining, the ones loitering, will be relocated, just as we relocated in 70 AD. And there's people picking, was 70 AD the fulfillment of the Great Tribulation? Well, if you listen to them, they're saying that it's nothing that the Lord's churches would go through. So we're out because according to them, it's already behind us. And even then, we're the ones who fled and didn't even go into our houses to gain access to our personal property. Jesus taught us to come off the rooftop and get out of there when you see the army surrounding. So those who teach 70 AD is the fulfillment of the Great Tribulation agree that God's people are relocated. So we never went through that. It was 1.1 million people who were the victims of the false proclamation by the Pharisee and Sadducee, peace and safety come indoors. So in the future, in futurism, the construct says that we're removed from the earth when there's no place left. We're relocated. So, but again, if you just constantly are being played and then all you know to do is play another person. I asked a sociopath once. He was very hostile. Learned later his background. He was expelled from school. He was incompetent socially to even receive the discipline to complete design curriculum. He had to be deported from his hometown, shipped off somewhere to finish. So he was very hostile to people. Let's say you were a righteous person and you were doing good, serving in the ecclesia. You were holding fast to that profession, that testimony of Christ conferred upon you in baptism. You're now fellowshipping into the gospel. You're taking responsibility to self-examine, self-care. Well, he didn't do any of that, and it was nothing new for me. I've seen it everywhere in the world. but to notice that he wanted to examine everyone else, like Jesus said, the Pharisee can notice a splinter in your eye, but not a board in his own. Well, that's the opposite if you actually are in a fellowship that's into the gospel. We examine ourselves. As Jesus taught, we not only self-examine, but we self-correct. He said, I tell you what, why don't you cut off your own hand? Why don't you pluck out your own eye? Why don't you cut off your own foot? So he was just quite the opposite on every point of Christianity, especially in the ecclesia. And there were people quite intimidated. I don't know why. I think it's like a lot of us, we just had a better things to do with our life than to find ourselves painted in a corner with a sociopath. But since he wasn't corrected by his parents, he wasn't raised up, and he was subject to authority, and he despised and rejected things that were honorable, he would really, pick on people. And what you'll do is you'll paint yourself in a corner, somewhat like a Calvinist, for example. I heard one recently say that not only does God take evil and can bring good out from it, but he was saying God actually did it. So that's what happens when you just constantly go to, now they're painted in a corner. How do you come back now? As I asked one Calvinist, so what's going through God's mind, as he and some other Calvinists were saying, that as distasteful as that might be, that includes molestation and crimes against children, that God's decreeing that or ordaining that, whatever word they use. And so I just asked, I said, well, what's going through God's mind while he's raping a child? Well, see, wait a minute, we didn't mean that. We didn't mean that. Well, what do you mean? Well, in the need to catalyze and cause a reaction and to somehow keep some energy going in these dead constructs, you just keep going until you'll say, now, why I'm not allowed to say that God is the author of sin is because he's not. And I fear the Lord, and I'm not permitted to say that he ordains, decrees the immoral actions of man. As I was biblically taught and have no incentive to so get involved in a game of extremes that we just have to keep going. Make it more extreme. Because see what that is that reminds me of the people I have to intervene and counsel. People start recreational drugs. They then need a more extreme experience. And eventually you're called in and they're in a hospital, or worse, they're dead because they just had to keep heightening the experience. When you get in this game of, are you young or old? Well, what are we going to do? How many years do we go with young now before we swing back? Well, again, as a pastor of one of the Lord's churches, especially a church that identifies with the faith all the way back to the days of Christ, unashamedly, and they know the prevalence of the Lord's churches. They know the purpose of the perseverance that he gives us in character as an attribute of the Spirit to help us be resilient to these constant games, if you will. And we're here to influence our community. We're here for the glory of God and the good of our community, and we're here to adhere to Jesus' teachings, grow up to the full measure. I help parents, help young men become strong fathers like I am. I help encourage families to ignore the pressures in the world and see the value of life and more abundantly instead of the death that is offered by the world, and to guard your children unashamedly, unapologetically. Don't say you're sorry for guarding your children. Train them upwardly, train up your children. So this is what happens. So played preachers play people. I mean, if I'd bought into old earthism, whatever that was, now I'd be out, well, I'm not going to get burned this time. Nobody's playing me. So I'm taking on the young earth mantle. Well, okay. It doesn't take a lot of thought to do that. You do notice that people that don't even have any more interest in the Bible than what type it says translation, it might be KJV, NKJV, NASB, whatever, NIV. That's about it. That's about as much investment of mental exertion to just swing back and forth. So what do we do, though, as those who pastor the Lord's churches? Well, you remember we talked before, there was that open versus closed theism. And somebody says, you just reviewed this a lot. Well, this time I'm showing you how it happened. I was reading how R.C. Sproul, the late R.C. Sproul, had become primed to teach regeneration precedes faith, and it wasn't anything he believed, wasn't anything he could find in the Bible, but it was written on a board in a class by a professor. So he then went out and began to somehow say, and then concede that, well, not temporally, which, okay, but logically prior, which I don't really know where you would ascertain. And I don't know people with intellectual competency to say, oh, yes, I'm aware somewhere up here in my reasoning. So I don't know. But again, this can go so far as that you're like, no, I don't think it's enough anymore that God decrees the consequences of our moral actions. I want to say decrees my immoral actions. It's not enough to say that God takes evil and can bring good out of it. I want to say he's actually the one causing the evil. Well, you'll get there. If you have, you'll just totally, it's construct fatigue. They just wear it. I mean, you go until you can't go anymore, but how do you come back? I mean, one thing a pastor will teach you, and Bible students will, as pastors, we teach people, don't travel a road from which you can't return. Now, I have no problem with people coming back. You don't burn a bridge with me. If you need to study whatever this is without defining the term, or you need to study this without defining the term, I would recommend you try to find a definition. Try to find, like Dr. Al Mohler was saying, trying to explain, as he was, that the earth looks so old because of the severity of sin. Well, he's referring to the accelerated decay rate, which he didn't have that researched. And of course, with as much work as he does, he's probably like some preachers. They just don't have time for this stuff, to use holism. But remember, we have living God from the Torah to the Revelation, which is interesting. Because I wonder what he thinks as the living God when people can almost flippantly and almost in a trite way say, I'm here to tell you that God decrees the wicked actions of men. God ordained your child to be abducted, raped, molested. So it's really when the ratings are down. I mean, you have to do that. If you notice on television, I didn't have that honor. I spent hours around television growing up. Worked before school, after school, every Saturday, full time in school. Worked in the hay fields from first day out of school to the first day back to school. Work permit to begin working in grocery, a privately owned grocery store when I was 15. So you worked produce, you sack the groceries, you unload manually unload them. So now I can see things, and where the late coming online to the computer, 2010, having my own to try to use one. Didn't even have one in the office. What would I do with it? I had a Bible. I had things to study. I didn't need it. So it seems that the things that are there today have to just become more extreme. One man who was recovering from it was interviewed, and I was involved in that process, and he just said that, for example, sensuality, S, and alcohol, A, and then drugs, D, SAD, that nothing could gratify him any longer. Not only was what he was once gratified by no longer satisfied, it never satisfied him, but now he couldn't even be gratified by it. So he was at the brink of complete termination. He was about to end his own life at his own hand, which he was already doing that anyway. He was already self-destructive. But a lot of this about these constructs, it's about like that. When I hear someone say, let me tell you, not only, so you'd have a hard time finding any text that could assign culpability to God for the wretched acts of men. But living God, I wonder what he thinks about it when he hears people so flippant and irreverently assigning to him, which is interesting, isn't it? Finite, fallen, finite. Fallible, sinful man is making all these. You wouldn't say that. Fear of the Lord would stop you immediately. So I'll just say it as a pastor, an actual pastor of one of the Lord's churches, and working, laboring, and toiling in the field. I wouldn't even. First of all, you can't debate someone that says it. Like Calvin was quoted by a Piper, whatever that is, John Piper, and he's supposedly says all these things. I don't know why he would appropriate, but how would we have a debate if he couldn't even establish his assertion? If you just waited on where's the text that says this? Well, there's no text. What he's done is we just have to keep moving this out because we can't incite the crowd anymore. They're numb to this. They're dead to it. Well, Jesus came to give us life, not to fatigue us, not for us to become desensitized. And that's exactly what happens. It's like overemphasizing crises after crises. I worked in one organization and it was always a crisis. Well, after a while, you just sat there and one person said, I don't think Mr. Carter is as affected by what I'm saying as I think he should be. Meaning he noticed it's like, I've seen this before. I mean, the sky's falling, chicken little faith, the company's going to close, we're going to be sold. It's just, now the news says the end of the economy. Well, no, our economy ended in the 70s with Jimmy Carter. We had lines backed up. We couldn't find gas. And the world came to an end before the 70s because in the 60s, the heterosexual revolution, they redefined marriage. They assured that all the laws against perversity in their heterosexual ambitions were all removed from the books, and they can now practice serial monogamy, divorce on demand, live together. So the heterosexual revolution was quite remarkable. Those males and females, it totally deconstructed anything. But now where are they? Most of them found themselves at a dead end because they had a dead beginning when you deconstruct the Bible doctrine of marriage. But here, this is why people don't fear him, because they don't remember, or it doesn't occur to them. Maybe they've had their consciences seared for you to be able to say such flippant, trite things about God. But I know I gained the attention of a man when he was asking me some of these things that were being asserted. And I just said, well, why don't you ask yourself what is going through the mind of God when he's raping a child? He was stunned. Well, because after all, you're just using euphemistic language if you're among these Calvinists that are at the end of their catalysis. They just don't have anything else to incite the people. And you have to say, so you start saying ordain, causes, I guess. Well, why don't you just say he's doing it? God's doing it. Not even one molecule of that in the created universe that's involved in the conspiracy and execution of an abduction and molestation and rape and death of a child escapes God's control and manipulation in that heinous crime. But, it's just, it's what happens when you've been played. Now you got to go play others. And you can't stop because you can't come back. Unless you repent, mind in association with the living God. But who's teaching living theism from the Torah to the Apostle? Unless you're in one of the Lord's churches. Who's teaching living theism? Who's teaching fear of the Lord? You see young people's lives being destroyed. You see all that happening everywhere out there. And again, we still have people saying, debating free will, just wearing people out. And what would the pastor of a Baptist church, one who searches the scriptures, one who respects God's word? First, you notice this phrase isn't anywhere in the Bible. We have one word, no space, in the English Old Testament referring to a free will offering. That is, it wasn't designated previously by the Bible, but we have in the Bible causal agency. Anybody can look that up. Matter of fact, if you'd want to go to Psalm 23, where it says, maketh me to lie down, and click on that word in your blueletterbible.org, blueletterbible.org, and you'll notice when you check that word out, the inflectional morpheme, the morphology, you'll see the word hiphil, H-I-P-H, and it'll tell you it's causal. And then you can go to the text where Moses was told by God to use the staff to cast it down, it becomes a serpent, take it back up, it becomes a staff, so that the people might cause themselves to exercise, if you will, the free will, because free will is a fine phrase to say if you just have a Bible definition. The Baptists impressed me by saying church, but now we mean assembly. And what do you mean by assembly? Well, we mean an outcalled, an ecclesia, kaleo, ecclesia, from the verb kaleo, transliteration of call, and severed their ties, broke away from all that Christ called them to come out from. For example, Matthew, when he left the tax collector's booth, he abandoned that corrupt system that exploited those in the covenant community. So it's really great because people went from, there's a free will Baptist church, there's a sovereign grace Baptist church. You notice how one's been played, so now we'll just go play the people. Got played by sovereign grace, whatever that meant. So now we're going to go play people as free in the name of free will Baptist. So it just goes back and forth. But remember, played preachers play people, played people play people, played religious people play people, played Catholics play people. I don't know what form of Catholicism they advocate today. They don't know either. So we just keep going. I'm not sure how extensive this is, but it's really something. I'll end with the, let's say, atonement. Let's say you played atonement game. So you took limited or unlimited. So you were played. Now you switch sides, and because you were played, now you're going to play the other side. And then, of course, we have redemption. And, of course, you were played universal or particular. There we go. And but you're played. So you switch sides, and now you're going out. Well, you'll never notice that, according to the Bible, atonement was about sins. Remember in 1 John, not only for our sins, but for the sins of the whole world. So it's sins. So atonement's about sins, and redemption's about kins. The kinsman, redeemer, and the ones who trust him for everlasting life become the kinsman. And John 3:16 teaches the kinsman redeemer, the provision, the giving of the Son, so that those who are already believing might not perish, but rather have everlasting life. Those already believing into him. And then John 20:31 says, these things are written so that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ. Well, who would believe that Jesus is the Christ? How would you be persuaded that this particular Jesus is the Christ, and that believing in him you'd have life through his name? How would you be persuaded of that? Well, the kinsman redeemer was given for those who had trusted him for everlasting life. Jesus' blood atoned for not only our sins, but the sins of the whole world. That's between him and the Father. And then the Father recognizes nothing but the blood of his Son as the purchase price for those who trust his Son. And he told us to listen to his Son. So this is will help you out when you go out there and you see a preacher growling, snarling, one who's made his identity about post-trib, I can't remember which one he was, but he came in and he didn't want to discuss the Bible. He didn't want to talk about what the word after means in Matthew 24 in association with, as I've said that several times. He didn't want to talk about that. So he really had no interest. He didn't want to talk about the keeping of the word of his patience, which is why New Testament churches are about Christ, or it's not a New Testament church. I don't know what you call it, but if it's not about the blood of the new covenant, the blood of Christ, which is the blood of the new covenant, and if it's not about keeping the word of his patience, not our impatience, not our failures, our faults, our lapses, our fatigue, our times where we slide backwards, where we need to be restored, as the book of Galatians talks about, where we need to be picked up, where we need to be amended, repaired, we're broken, we're scratched, we're cut, we're maimed, if you will, and we need to be healed and helped by our shepherd. But this is about keeping the word of his patience, adhering it, promoting it, supporting it, focusing on it, magnifying that. And then, of course, Revelation 7:14, he didn't want to talk about those who came out from, because there is no place in the Bible that's through. And I remember watching a video, Dr. John Piper, and he was in this text, and he got to the out from, and he said, so he kind of started scribbling on his board because nobody wants a text that doesn't support what we believe, and we all want the Bible to say what we say, and that gives us, I guess, credibility. I don't know, but the Bible doesn't support any of these things. We are called to support the Bible. So here's the truth. Yeah, so we support the Bible. That's why it's such a labor for pastors to go back to the context to where this is, this statement, living God, or the true and living God, and then find those texts and then see the context and see the implication and then go all the way to Revelation, because even in this text where the people actually were so affected by the inbreaking of the voice of the living God that they asked Moses, now you go up there and talk to him, and then you come back and talk to us. And God said that he wished and would that they would always have a heart like that. But they didn't. So God wanted something, and he didn't, in that case, get it. But God was very much impressed. I would love to see these guys debating, and I'd love to see, let's say, a Calvinist that's gone to the extreme, to the end of his rope to try to somehow incite some reaction from people. And he's saying that, well, not only does God take evil and make good out of it, but God's actually the one authoring the evil, ordaining the evil, doing the evil. And then in the middle of that debate, the voice of the living God break in. It would be quite an outcome. But you say, well, what would it take for that? Well, something better than that has happened. I mean, if you went to the seminary and you're trained in what the Bible really says, you'll know that the scripture that teaches this is more than the experience that they had. So if you see someone, because of the scripture's revelation of the living God, unbridled in their speaking back towards him, then they have something about their conscience is starting to be seared, and they're becoming desensitized, and their fear of the Lord is really starting to be tamped down, and a lot of presumptions happening. So this is it. This is enough. When we run out of room on the board, the time's been too long, and I hope the sound's good. I'll check it this time. And just got back from a graveside service, a beautiful funeral, a beautiful lady, and was on the phone earlier with a husband. His wife's in hospice right now. She's a young lady, only 69, and a 92-year-old's in rehabilitative therapy. So because of the Lord's involvement with his pastors, holding us in his right hand, and his involvement as the chief shepherd of the flock, we can do our hermeneutics, our apologetics, we can do our language work, we can study our languages, we can preach the sermons, oversee the ordinances, feed the flock, go check on them in the hospitals, go counsel with them in a hospice consultation. We can set in with their families to help keep them intact and going forward. There's really nothing we can't do. So we can study any field, whatever we have to do. But this is just enough to demonstrate why. Because after all, if all you know is pre or post, you got to make one of them. One of them's got to do for you whatever it is you think you're here to do. But those of us who are called to support the Bible, it's a great responsibility, and it involves fear of the Lord and the living God. And I, like all the pastors of the Lord's churches, would say, we wish people would have that fear and that abiding effect from the reality of the inbreaking of the voice of the living God. So you have a blessed day.